everyone, it's Sam from JancesRobinson.com with your wine news in 5. Before I begin, I have 2 corrections. Last week, if you got to the news early, you heard me say that harvest had started in Russia and then reference harvest in Crimea. Crimea was illegally annexed by Russia from the Ukraine in 2014. It does not belong to Russia. I sincerely apologize. The article was corrected as soon as it was pointed out, and the podcast and video were both taken down immediately and reposted by midday Saturday. Secondly, I said Santorini was projected to harvest 700 kilograms in total. The unit on that was supposed to be tons. However, yesterday the local agriculture department told Stelios Botaris that the final number was slightly more than originally thought, 750 tons for whites and 130 tons for reds on Santorini. On to the news. Today I'm going to discuss a win for Swedish wines and hybrid vines, the release of the 2022 red and 2023 white Grosse Gewächse and the start of Germany's harvest, Brown-Forman's abandonment of diversity and inclusion programs, losses for Australian vintage and naked wines, and the lightweighting of bottles for top wines by Zuccardi. Starting with a win for Swedish wines and hybrid vines. First, if you didn't know that Sweden produces wine, you're not alone. While Erika Landon, in her entry for Sweden in the 5th edition of the Oxford Companion to Wine, points out that there is evidence of wine growing here that dates back to the Stone Age, Sweden wasn't actually registered with the EU for wine production until 1999. Today, the country has more than 200 wine growers, and to highlight the country's progress, about a decade ago, Swedish wine journalist Mikael Molstad began organizing the Swedish Wine Tasting, which is an annual blind tasting of 12 top Swedish wines and 12 similarly styled wines from elsewhere in Europe. This year, on August 28th, Julia Harding joined 17 other judges to participate in that tasting. All 12 of the wines from Sweden were made from hybrid grape varieties. One of these, Imelen 2021 Kullaberga Vingård, made from Solaris, Sauvignon Gris, and Muscaris, took top prize, and 3 others made the top 10. You can see the full results at the SwedishWineTasting.com. On to the release of the 2022 red, 2023 white Grosse Gewächse and the start of harvest in Germany. On September 1st, the VDP, a private wine organization that has their own heavily regulated vineyard classification system, will release their top-tier dry white wines from the 2023 vintage and red wines from the 2022 vintage. These wines are known as Grosse Gewächse, or GGs, and this year there were 561 of them approved from 11 different Anbaugebiete, which wine growing regions, and from 8 grape varieties: Riesling, Spätburgunder, Weissburgunder, Sylvaner, Grauburgunder, Lemberger, Chardonnay, and Frühburgunder. Our German wine specialist, Paula Sidor, attended a pre-release tasting of these and will be providing her thoughts on the wines in the coming weeks. I highly encourage you to keep an eye out for both the new releases and for Paula's report. She shared that there are some absolutely stellar wines, but there's also quite a bit of variability due to the wet and warm conditions and condensed harvest window in 2023. She also pointed out that high disease pressure this year, 2024, plus the early frost has led to predictions of a much lower than average yield, which may impact next year's release. And speaking of the 2024 vintage, harvest began on August 19th in the Pfalz. Since then, grapes have been harvested in Rheinhessen, Baden, and Ahr. Next, the U.S. company Brown-Forman abandons diversity and inclusion programs. On August 21st, Brown-Forman, which owns Korbel sparkling wine, as well as popular spirits brands Jack Daniel's, Woodford Reserve, El Jimador, Chambord, and others, sent a company-wide email announcing that their executives' pay would no longer be tied to DEI targets. Previously, 10% of short-term compensation had been tied to DEI goals. That they would stop participating in an annual ranking of companies with an LGBTQ-friendly work environment, and that they were abandoning plans to focus more on suppliers with minority backgrounds. Seemingly, the reason that they've done this is because of an alt-right influencer, Robbie Starbuck, who's been going after brands who have a traditionally conservative audience and exposing their DEI programs so that their target audience boycotts their products. His attacks have resulted in brands like Harley-Davidson, John Deere, and now Brown-Forman cutting DEI programs. While I don't buy Korbel, I do like Chambord as well as the next person, but I think I'll be buying a different raspberry liqueur. On to losses at Australian vintage and naked wines. Back in June, I talked about how Accolade Wines, one of Australia's 2 largest producers, had backed out of plans to purchase Australian Vintage, Australia's 3rd largest producer. Australian Vintage immediately suspended their shares on the Australian Stock Exchange. They raised 15 million Australian dollars by selling discounted shares, and they secured $30 million in debt capacity, which allowed them to stay afloat. But it seems that all has not gone well, because on August 23rd, AV posted a $93 million loss in the 2024 financial year. This contrasts sharply with the $4 million in profit they netted last year. Their acting CEO has been replaced for the 3rd time in 12 months. Meanwhile, in the UK, Naked Wines, whose troubles I discussed back in January, posted an 18% loss for the 2024 financial year. Both Australian Vintage and Naked Wines have said that they have plans in place to restructure and return to profit. Finally, a good piece of news. Zuccardi, a respected Argentinian producer, has decreased their bottle weights by 37% from 900 grams to 570 grams. While plenty of producers are joining the lightweighting movement, starting with their entry and their mid-tier wines, Zuccardi is notable because they are prioritizing lightweighting their most expensive and lauded offerings. Their 2021 Finca Canal de Uco, retailing for around $100 USD, will launch on the Place de Bordeaux next month in a lightweight bottle. Their mid-tier wines will follow. They've lightweighted in this order to send a clear message that bottle weight does not correlate to wine quality. That's all for this episode of the Wine News. I'm not going to be bringing you the news next week, as I will be in London for the 67 Pall Mall Global Wine Communicator Awards. The next newscast will be on the 13th or 14th of September, depending on where you are in the world. If you have information on the start of harvest in places I haven't yet mentioned, please email me at news@jancesrobinson.com. Thanks.